Hello YouTube, and welcome to my Axis and Allies channel. This video is going to be a little bit different than most of my other videos. We're going to take a step back, and instead of looking at an individual game or an individual country and strategy within a game, we are going to take a look at all of the Axis and Allies games throughout history that I own, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second. And we're going to go ahead and rank them. Now, there is always a little bit of subjectivity when it comes to any kind of a ranking, whether it be a top 10 list or top 5 list or what have you. So in preparation for this video, I decided that I would come up with a series of measures and a scoring system to rank this, to try and minimize that subjectivity and make it a little bit more objective, while still recognizing there is going to be some subjectivity involved. So I am going to look at five different areas and evaluating each one of these games. And the areas that I am looking at are inherent balance of the game, the quality of the game relative to the rest of the series, my personal experience, so there is one category that's based more on subjective experience. But when it comes to that, there are some games that I've played more and some that I have not played as much. So I'm also considering what I know of the game and how much I think that I would enjoy it if I did play it. That is going into the personal experience category as well. And then the next category is series impact. Was this game the first one where some new things were tried, some new mechanics, and did they stick around? Or if new things were tried, were they thrown out? Can you see the natural evolution of the Axis and Allies rules coming out of this game into other ones? Does it have that lasting impact? And then the kind of a pseudo fifth category, if there is anything that's truly game breaking in terms of like balance, or even efforts to try and rebalance the game have not been successful. I created a category for that. There really is only one that got a little negative to its score. Now, in terms of each of these categories, I am not ranking them, ranking every single game like a 1 through whatever. Instead, each game can score either a good, moderate, poor, or not applicable in those categories. And a good is worth so many points, a moderate's worth so many points, and so forth. I tried my best to minimize the not applicables, and I'll talk about those a little bit when we get to that point. There are very few of those, and I'll touch on why I gave those games those scores. So that's just kind of a rundown of how we're going to go about doing this. So I will go through each one of those categories, and I just want to outline the games that either scored a poor or a good or a not applicable. A moderate basically means it's in between, or I didn't have enough information or enough experience to really definitively say that it was either good or poor. So rather than handicap a game or give it extra bonus points, I called it a moderate. So there were a few instances where I had to do that. Now, with that said, there are a few adjustments, not in terms of the scoring, but a few things that I want to get out of the way. Now, you see all of these games lined up here. They are not stacked in any particular order. As far as scoring goes, they are simply stacked based on box size. It makes it a little bit easier for them to stack up and distribute, just having all the boxes that are of the same size in the same stacks. In addition to that, we will be considering 1940 Europe and Pacific together. We are just going to call that global. We're not going to evaluate those two games separately. We are also going to consider kind of the far offshoot games, Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and Guadalcanal, which I do not own, though I'm on the lookout for it on eBay. That's actually how I got Battle of the Bulge and a few other games. I'm on the lookout for it. We're going to consider those three to be the same game. I mean, I know that they have very different rules, but for the purposes of evaluation, we are going to consider them of the same brand. Just like we are considering Pacific and Europe 1940 to be one game, and we're looking at second edition. There was a first edition game, a few cosmetic changes from what I understand that were made. We are not going to evaluate first edition. Now, with that said, we do have Spring 1942 and 1942 second edition, and I debated considering Spring 42 and Revise, which is this blue boxed one down here, to be the same game because the differences were fairly minimal. But when I thought about it, you've got new units, you've got new rules, kind of based on the anniversary set for your Spring 1942, which changed it enough that I think it deserves to be considered on its own. So that is what we have going on here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk inherent balance at first. Now, we've got a couple not applicables for here, and that's going to be Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and Guadalcanal. I have looked through the rule book for D-Day and Battle of the Bulge, and I have looked over the rules for Guadalcanal, read a little bit about it online, even though I don't have a copy, and there's not enough, really. The games are so different and compared to regular Axis and Allies that I really don't feel like I can gauge what the inherent balance is for those games. So I'm going to give them a not applicable in that category. Now, moving on to the pores, I do have a few in this group, and I would consider the balance of, the inherent balance of Axis and Allies Pacific, Classic, 1942 second edition, and Europe. Where are you, Europe? You're down there. And the original Europe to probably be poor in this category. Now, we could nitpick and we could say, well, some are more extreme than others, but I didn't want to get too far into the weeds because that's going to create even more subjectivity. Well, you mark this as a poor and it should be a very poor, or good and it should be a very good as opposed to just a regular good. So we're not going to worry about that. But I've taken a look at 1941. I haven't played it, but I've set it up, and I know that it was designed to be a learning game, but from the kind of starting look of it, it didn't look like it was very balanced, in my opinion. Pacific, also not a ton of experience playing it. I just got a couple of those videos up, and right away people were commenting from their experience that the game seemed fairly unbalanced. And I think that with Japan's ability to really rack up those victory points early in game, my take is that it probably is a little bit unbalanced as well. And then you've got Classic, and the reason I say Classic is unbalanced is because first, if you remember back, if you played the game, you had what was called Axis Advantage because it was so unbalanced. And that meant that Russia couldn't attack on the first turn, and Germany got jet fighters, and Japan got super subs. Even then, you've got that Karelia province that just kind of overhangs the entire eastern front for Germany and Russia, which just bogs down that front, and it just becomes both sides building up, building up, and building up forever. You did also have, if the Axis got, I believe it was 84 production, then they won by they got an economic victory. I remember early on playing Classic, our first few games, the Axis tended to win, but once my gaming group got used to the game, the Allies seemed to win almost there was not even a discussion about Axis advantage. We always played with that, and the Allies still tended to win. So I would consider that a little bit unbalanced. And then Europe, I debated that one a little bit, if it should be considered go in the moderate category or poor. I decided to put it in the poor category just because I've read some things about the German stack. If they do a certain thing, supposedly they can march all the way to Moscow. I've never tried it myself or seen it tried, but Germany just starts with so much stuff. It really has to conquer Russia. Now, if it does that, then the game is pretty much over. But the Allies have the Allies produce almost twice as much production as Germany. So I think in that game, it's it's unbalanced for Germany early in game, and then it becomes severely imbalanced if the game lasts more than a handful of turns in favor of the Allies. So I consider that to be overall unbalanced. Now, on the flip side of that, you have your balanced. Our revised, our blue box down here, is considered to be one of the more balanced versions generally of the game. And then you have the remake of that with Anniversary Edition rules, Spring 1942. I consider that to be pretty well balanced because it's basically the same thing. My understanding of Global is that it is fairly well balanced as well. And then Anniversary Edition over here is also considered, by and large, to be an exceptionally balanced version of the game, from what I understand and from my experience. Now, let's go ahead and move on to general quality. Again, I have not applicables for Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and Guadalcanal. 1941, I know that it's kind of designed to be a cheap version of the game, a beginner version. I remember opening it, and my immediate feel was that, yeah, they cut all the corners that they could. I would consider that to be a poor quality. And then 1942 Second Edition. 1942 Second Edition, I enjoy the game, but there are just so many little things, from lack of money to things on the map that aren't quite right, like the Sahara Desert isn't colored like a impassable area. Germany and I think England, if you count up the number of IPCs that the game says they get, it doesn't match the territories they actually start with on the board. And all of that is a real shame because it is a good game, but just, in my opinion, showed a lack of quality control, and I couldn't feel right about giving it a strong score in this category. On the flip side of that, for quality, I mark both Global over here, the amount of thought and intricacies that have gone into it, as well as Anniversary over here, to score very well in the quality category. Now, in terms of personal experience, I had no pours in this group, but again, the big offshoots, Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and Guadalcanal get NA scores from me, not applicable. Classic is the game I started with. It's kind of what got me into this series, and I have very fond memories of playing that, so I gave that a good score. 1942 is one of the games, in addition to 1914, that really got me back into the series, and I've enjoyed playing both in casual as well as tournament settings. I'm sure this will come as no surprise to anyone, but 1914, with tournament rules, of course, I've had very good experience with that, a lot of fun, so I gave that a good score. Revised, our blue box, is also gets a good score for that category. That's kind of, if Classic was the game that I started with, that I learned with in high school, Revised was kind of the college game where I really came into my own in Axis and Allies, and started to consider myself to be a good player rather than or a good tier player rather than just a casual player. And then Anniversary Edition, I've played a number of rounds of that, and it has been fun every time. Now, our next category is going to be the series impact. When it comes to these offshoots, D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, and Guadalcanal, those games, I really haven't seen anything of note in those games that is translated to anything else. So those all get a poor score there. 1941 is kind of the same thing. There was no new innovation from what I could tell in that game, so it gets a poor for series impact. They did try a number of new things with Axis and Allies Pacific, so I give them credit for that. But the rules that they had, I really did not see translated into anything else. Yes, you do have naval bases, you have air bases, but the rules are totally different for those in Global, and I don't believe that those were used in any other game until Global came along. I'm not giving a poor for global just because it was the last World War II version to come out, and I do see some things from there that kind of held over to Larry Harris's new game, War Room. So I think that it would be unfair to give global a poor just because there hasn't been anything. We haven't been able to see if their stuff translates, and I feel like if there were additional games made, there would be some things from global that would be carried over, like scrambling planes and things of that nature. I do consider Spring 1942 to be poor simply because it basically took the map from Revised and then the rule set and a couple new units added from Anniversary Edition and rolled it into the same game. So it really wasn't, from what I have observed, anything new coming out of 1942. It's just a merging of those two other games. And so I give it a poor for future impact. Let's see here. What did I miss? Sorry if I jumped around a little bit. I'm looking at a note sheet that I have off on the side here. Okay, well, we'll move on to the good in this category. So, of course, series impact, we can't give Classic anything other than a good. That's what started the whole thing, and everything, all future rules, all future versions build on what was created here. So it gets a good, mark there. Europe, the original Europe, is good here. There was introduced several new units, and while they've been like artillery, and then destroyers, and destroyers have been tweaked over time, but this was the first game to introduce them. And so it introduced a few new concepts that have been present since, as well as convoys. That's something that was new in that game. And then Anniversary Edition. There is a ton that was introduced. New rule sets for transports, cruisers are added, all sorts of things. And so Anniversary definitely earns high marks in this category. Now, the last group that I'm going to talk about is the game breaking, and then I'm actually going to stop this video because my phone is running out of space. So I'm going to make this a two-parter. I'll go ahead and upload this, and then I will create, and I'll probably rearrange my table so it'll be a little more conducive to the list. But then I'll create a second video where we are past all of this criteria, and we're just going to get into the ranking. So as far as game breaking, in fact, the only one that I had on that list was actually Classic. As much as I hate to do it, I gave it a small negative just because even with the rebalancing, it is still a very unbalanced game, in my opinion, even with the Axis advantage. I thought about doing that for 42nd edition as well, but a little over a year ago, I think it was, new tournament rules came out for Gen Con and Origins, and they seem to knock the average bid from like 20-something for the Allies to single digits. Much more in line with what you can normally expect from your Revised, where it's like maybe plus 4 to 7 or so. That seems to be where 42nd edition sits now with the new tournament rules. So I decided not to give any other game a negative. There were a few games where I did think about it, but just because through lack of experience, I don't want to inadvertently give any board a negative if I'm not very confident that things are out of balance. So I went ahead and just gave that to Classic. For some of these games, based on this scoring, you can probably take a good guess as to where some of them have landed, but we're going to save that for the next video. So I hope you all enjoyed this one. I'm going to go ahead and stop this one and get it uploaded and rearrange my table, and then I will get the definitive, at least as far as my opinion goes, definitive list of best Axis and Allies games.